Hello, everyone. On behalf of the International Association of Chiefs of Police and with support from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, I'm happy to welcome you to today's webinar, Promoting Public Safety Through Diversion in a Housing-First Approach. My name is Karen Moline, and I'm a project manager at the IACP for the Safety and Justice Challenge, an initiative funded by the MacArthur Foundation to encourage the creation of just and effective local justice systems. Before we get started, I'd like to go over some logistics about today's webinar. We are recording this webinar, and it will be posted on our website in a matter of days. We'll send a link to everyone who registered and post it on the Safety and Justice Challenge Exchange and the Diversion Hub. We'll also send it out through the PTAC newsletter. We've scheduled plenty of time for questions at the end of the webinar. If you'd like to submit a question to one of the presenters, please use the chat feature on your screen to do that and send it to all or panelists. Panelists are all organizers. And speaking of the chat feature, if you are listening to this webinar as a group, please help us get a good count of attendees by clicking on chat, typing the name of the person registered for the webinar, and then entering the number of additional people in the room with you. We really appreciate it. Finally, at the conclusion of today's webinar, you'll be asked to take a brief evaluation survey about today's presentation. The information you provide will help us plan and improve future webinars, and it's very much appreciated. So enough with logistics, let's get started. ICP is a strategic ally for the Safety and Justice Challenge, an initiative that supports leaders in jurisdictions around the country. These jurisdictions are working to make their local justice systems more fair, efficient, and effective. In a nutshell, the MacArthur Foundation is working to reduce incarceration and the overuse of jails. Milwaukee is one of the jurisdictions participating in the Safety and Justice Challenge, and I was fortunate to see a presentation by one of today's presenters, James Matthey, on their HousingFirst initiative at an SJC meeting in the fall of 2017. The data he presented at that meeting were very convincing and memorable. IACP is also a founding member of the Police Treatment and Community Collaborative, whose mission is to enhance the quantity and quality of community behavioral health and social service options through engagement and pre-arrest diversion. Our presenter, Kim Keaton, represents the Corporation for Supportive Housing at PTAC meetings and mentioned at one of those meetings that we should be highlighting the important role of stable and permanent housing in the implementation of pre-arrest diversion for homeless individuals, especially those struggling with mental illness or substance use disorders. And that's when I knew I had to get these presenters together for a national webinar. At this time, I'd like to thank the MacArthur Foundation for supporting this webinar, as well as our ongoing work in pre-arrest diversion with the PTAC Collaborative. And on behalf of PTAC, I'd like to invite anyone who is interested in having a voice in pre-arrest diversion to go to the new PTAC website and sign up to become involved in one or more of the 6 available strategy areas. So before we get started, here's a little information about today's presenters. We'll have their full bios on our webinar page. Kim Keaton has nearly 15 years of experience in policy and analysis in the homeless and housing sector. As part of CSH's National Strategy and Impact Team, she leads replication and scaling of their signature FUSE initiative, which has been implemented in nearly 30 communities across the country. She helps to guide communities in efforts to cross-match data systems for effective targeting of frequent users of multiple public systems, such as corrections, homeless services, and hospitals and health systems. She also works with partners in the justice system to improve access to and increase supportive housing for vulnerable justice-involved people. Ms. Keaton holds a Master of Public Administration from New York University's Wagner School. James Matthey is responsible for management of Milwaukee County's Housing Authority and a myriad of housing, special needs housing, and homeless programs. He is the author of Milwaukee County's Plan to End Chronic Homelessness, which has led to a 45% reduction in overall homelessness since 2015. Milwaukee County remains on pace to be the largest county in the nation to end chronic homelessness by the end of 2018. Mr. Matthey has 20 years experience working in the housing and community health field with a focus on the development of homeless programs and permanent supportive housing. He has a master's degree from Marquette University in public service. And Lieutenant Cassandra Liebel has been with the Milwaukee Police Department for 23 years, serving most recently as the Crisis Intervention Team and Homeless Outreach Team, or HOT, coordinator. In this role, she monitored, coordinated, and managed the activities and training of the CIT-HOT and served as the department's liaison to mental health professionals, community resource organizations, city agencies, and consumers. She was also responsible for working with other divisions to research and monitor the applicability of department policies and procedures related to emergency detentions, CIT, and HOT, as well as assisting with necessary changes to the standard operating procedures. The CIT-HOT coordinator also oversees the daily operations of the Crisis Assessment Response Team. Thank you all for being here today. Kim, why don't you start us off with an overview of Housing First and how it fits in with pre-arrest diversion?
Great, thank you, Karen. And thank you everybody for attending the webinar today. We're really excited to talk about Housing First today and what's going on in Milwaukee County. So first, I want to talk a little bit about my organization. Next slide, please, if I don't have the control. Great, thank you. So CSH stands for Corporation for Supportive Housing. We're a national nonprofit with regional offices and staff throughout the country. We focus on supportive housing and housing solutions to improve the lives of vulnerable people. And we also help communities maximize their public resources through creating supportive housing. Our ultimate goal is really to build strong, healthy communities. Next slide. So the Housing First model. Housing First is an approach that offers permanent, affordable housing as quickly as possible for individuals and families experiencing homelessness, and then provides the supportive services and connections to the community-based supports people need to keep their housing and avoid returning to homelessness. In this presentation, I will discuss both how this model works in your local homeless systems and also what it can mean in the context of pre-arrest diversion and deflection programs in your communities. We were going to try to do a little poll today, and it may be popping up on your screen now. There, great. So we want to know how familiar you are with the Housing First model. Please select one. So either you're very familiar, your community uses this model, you're familiar with it, but perhaps your community doesn't use it. You're not familiar, but you're curious, and just you've never heard of it. Okay, so we have almost half of folks saying that they're familiar with it and their community uses the model, and almost the other half familiar or curious. So that's great, and let's move on. We'll get everybody up to speed. Great. Let's see if I can get this next slide going. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the homeless system and what Housing First means in the context of the homeless service interventions that are funded by HUD. So HUD is the federal agency that really does a lot of, stands for Housing and Urban Development. They fund regional continuums or continua of care that include homeless and housing service providers. And these service providers, these continua of care, offer a few main types of interventions to help people experiencing homelessness across the country. And those three interventions are emergency shelters, temporary housing, so that's housing that has a time limit to it, after which people are expected to, get out on their own again. And then there's permanent housing with supportive services. So, in the past, it's a little bit of a history lesson here, but in the past, about maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was typical to do sort of a progressive engagement approach where you would get somebody into emergency shelter and, hope that they stop using substances and demonstrate that they're committed to sobriety or to, engaging with mental health counselors before you would, determine whether they were eligible for either of the other two interventions. So you sort of made people go through a series of steps. But what people found and what providers found across the country was that they had housing slots for people and there was no people to put in them because people really tended to fail out of those expectations. And so over time, Housing First approach was born, and in the past 5 years or so, HUD has increasingly required that providers demonstrate that they are using a Housing First approach. And the reason is simple: homelessness is solved first and foremost by providing a home, and that home can be a platform for recovery from mental, behavioral, and physical afflictions. And it should be noted that while Housing First came about as a model of permanent supportive housing, um, it has been adopted in home systems in each of these types of interventions throughout the country, including in Milwaukee, which you'll hear about, for all the interventions they offer, such as shelters. All right. Whoops. Slide. Okay, great. So Housing First has two central premises: quick rehousing and housing-focused voluntary services. So Housing First is recognized as a proven response to the problem of homelessness, and it rests on these two simple premises. First, rapid rehousing should be the central goal of our work with the people experiencing homelessness. Second, by providing housing assistance and case management services, time-limited or long-term, after an individual is housed, we can significantly reduce the time people spend in homelessness, which is a traumatic experience, and prevent further episodes of homelessness. The Housing First approach was initially created for the chronically homeless population, which has traditionally been the hardest group to serve. The philosophy has been adopted to serve many populations since. Housing First programs, whether for families or chronically homeless adults with psychiatric disabilities or substance use disorders, generally focus on helping their target populations to move as quickly as possible into permanent supportive housing of varying types, and then provides them with voluntary home-based support services. By voluntary services, what I mean is that keeping the housing voucher that's paying for the rent is not dependent on whether the person is participating in services, which could mean anything from regular case management meetings to attending outpatient substance use treatment and more. So you might be asking yourself, you can't make tenants meet with you and you can't make them participate in services, so how are they even helped? So something we like to say at CSH is that while the services are voluntary for tenants, the services are not voluntary for the staff that is trying to engage them. It's the staff's job to use outreach and engagement strategies and to build relationships with those tenants, build relationships and trust to help the tenants connect with the services that they find helpful, that will help them reach their goals and keep them housed. The Housing First model then really leaps over the barriers that housing-ready models put in front of people before they can obtain housing. So instead of making tenants meet certain requirements before you help them find housing, if you are working with the Housing First model, you help your tenant obtain housing as quickly as possible without creating extra roadblocks for them, like requiring sobriety for a certain amount of time, mandate that they be compliant with medication regimens, mandating that they establish a bank account or improve their credit before accessing housing. Then, once the tenant has obtained housing first, you provide wraparound services to help the tenant stay in housing and work towards whatever goals that tenant has. So what's the evidence for Housing First? Years of research starting from the 1990s when Pathways to Housing in New York City started its first program have led to consensus in our field that Housing First works. The housing retention rates in the Housing First model are much higher than in other models of supportive housing. Programs that follow high fidelity to the Housing First model tend to have housing retention rates of 75 to 80%. So that means 75 to 80% of people who are housed with the Housing First approach remain in housing for at least a year or so. There have been numerous studies as well that show that using the Housing First model results in fewer emergency room visits, incidents with the criminal justice system, and avoids long-term stays in mental health hospitals. This saves taxpayer money and is less taxing on these systems, resulting in higher quality of life for the people who live in Housing First programs. The evidence supporting the Housing First model was compelling enough for HUD, the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, to adopt Housing First as the preferred program model to end homelessness, and for SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to list it as an official evidence-based practice. So there are 7 main principles of Housing First, and of course, I don't have time to go through them all today. they can be grouped into those two central premises that we discussed earlier, that the client should be able to access housing quickly, and then that the housing should have flexible voluntary services to help keep the person housed. Because Housing First is an approach to accessing permanent supportive housing, which is a relatively resource-intensive model, units should be targeted to the most disabled and vulnerable. So you might be asking yourself how housing and Housing First can fit in with a pre-arrest diversion program effort in your community. So, are we even, sometimes I think that people are wondering if we're talking about the same people. Are people who are potentially eligible for pre-arrest diversion the same people who are eligible for permanent supportive housing and maybe chronically homeless? The answer to that is really yes. Many pre-arrest diversion programs that are intended to divert people from ever being involved or being involved more deeply in the criminal justice system are reporting that many of their clients are already homeless. Getting someone who's at this point into housing could vastly change the course of their lives rather than allowing them to become long-term homeless, which is a seriously traumatic life course. Some places where pre-arrest diversion programs intersect with homeless individuals are crisis or triage centers, emergency shelters, and outpatient clinics, whether those are substance use clinics like methadone or something like a healthcare for the homeless community health center. Housing can be a platform through engagement and treatment can help keep people successfully housed. So these two types of interventions can really work to support each other. And we'd love to know what you think. This is a relatively new field, and pre-arrest diversion, thinking about Housing First in the context of pre-arrest diversion, and we'd love to get your thoughts in the chat box. And I just want to close by saying I've really just scratched the surface, the 100,000-foot view here on Housing First. CSH, my organization, has an online training center, and we recently released a self-paced training on Housing First. We have a lot of other materials available through our training center that go really deeply on not only Housing First, but harm reduction philosophies, motivational interviewing, and a lot of the other services that are associated with supportive housing and keeping people housed. I'll put the link to this in the chat box after I turn the presentation over to Jim. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Kim. So now I'd like to introduce James Matthey from Milwaukee. Go ahead, James.
Great, thank you. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Kim, for that overview of Housing First, and thank you to the Corporation of Supportive Housing for your years of leadership in this space. So I'm going to be speaking specifically about how we've used Housing First in Milwaukee County for our plan to end chronic homelessness. And Lieutenant Liebel will be speaking about the role the police department has played. They played a major role in our plan, and they were one of the early adopters of Housing First in Milwaukee County. So the key principles of Housing First, so Kim went over these. There's some specific ones we focus on here in Milwaukee. Again, immediate access to housing is the most important thing. I think folks around the country often think of homeless shelters as a solution to homelessness. Our focus really is solely upon taking folks off the street and put them in permanent housing. The theory of permanent housing is that it can permanently end someone's cycle of homelessness, so that's our focus. Solution-focused case management and improved health outcomes. We have very, very flexible case management models. One of our statistics we're proud of for all the individuals in our Housing First program is 100% of them have voluntarily chosen case management, and I'll go over why later. It's really case management on their own terms that's important. Social community integration, social mobility. Community development has been a huge issue in Milwaukee. We have a lot of partnerships with the local business districts who used to kind of criminalize homelessness, really wanting folks off the street in the business districts. That has totally changed with the adoption of Housing First, really seeing homelessness as a community development and economic development issue, to where if our entire community embraces Housing First, We also see gains in the business district as well. And finally, cost savings associated with housing retention. We've been able to have a very high housing retention rate. It's right around 96% in our Housing First program. And that's resulted in quite a bit of cost savings on the criminal justice side, as well as on the behavioral health side. Where we began, we announced our plan to end chronic homelessness in the summer of 2015 with the goal of ending chronic homelessness within 3 years. So that was a pretty aggressive timeline, but we are approaching the end goal as we speak. So what we use for our data is the point in time. So point in time counts are what every community across the country does to show HUD how many homeless individuals there are. So you count individuals in homeless shelters, and you organize your homeless outreach activity to count individuals on the street. So when we started, we had roughly 200 chronically homeless individuals through point in time. We figured out quite quickly, like most communities, that that number was actually a lot higher than it was in point in time due to some data quality issues we had several years ago that are now fixed. And really what the plan is to house the most difficult to house. So the highest utilizers in public services, individuals who've been on the street longest, ones that continue to be incarcerated, be going to emergency rooms. Our initial goal was to do 100 individuals in the first 12 months over 303 years. Due to the demand and our focus on the creation of new permanent housing, we've served over 700 homeless individuals and families since we announced our plan. So we're serving a lot more people. And again, with the flexible nature of Housing First and the way that case management can be done, almost everybody is going to accept voluntary services once their basic needs are met and once they're in Housing First. Sorry, trying to advance my slide. There we go. So where are we now? So we are approaching functional zero for chronic homelessness, which we're very excited about. This is a federal definition, which means you get to zero chronically homeless individuals, and when future individuals show up on your list, you have the ability to house them immediately with a rental assistance voucher. So we only have about 5 or 6 individuals left at the current pace. All of them have vouchers. All of them have case managers. So once they move in, we will be at functional zero, and we'll be the largest county in the nation to reach that goal. So we're excited about that. As we have to tell the public, though, chronic homelessness is a sliver of overall homelessness. So to us, ending chronic homelessness is really just a start of something bigger and not necessarily the end of anything. We'd like to get to the point where we can help individuals on the street and in our shelters that do not meet that definition. And we have to be able to maintain zero for 90 days in order to declare. So we were at zero on June 1st. So hopefully next month we will be at our goal. So here's some of the data that goes along with that. So we've seen a massive decrease in overall homelessness in Milwaukee County. Our focus was chronically homeless individuals, but it has made a large dent in the overall population. As you can see in the graph in the slide, we started our Housing First initiative around September of 2015. And our community has done a great job over the past 10 or 15 years with fundraising. People have been very generous across Milwaukee, investing in shelters and outreach and various different things. We never saw much of a decrease until this laser focus on the increase in permanent housing, adopting Housing First, and newer services, what we call housing navigation. I'll get to that later. So we have seen a major decrease in homelessness since we started in 2015. So some other case studies that are really important, and all this does get back to the criminal justice system. Lieutenant Liebel is going to go over some municipal violation data and some of the cost savings later in her presentation. So one of the focuses that we have, because we get a lot of local tax levy funding from our behavioral health division, we wanted to be able to show that their investment is worthwhile. So the slide you see in front of you is a case study, an individual named Mark. And when you look at his mental health crisis service utilization, and this is just for the behavioral health division, this does not include private hospitals, HMO data, or any of that. This is simply through our Milwaukee County Behavioral Health Division, which runs a psychiatric hospital. So you can see his service utilization decline when he entered towards the middle of 2015 all the way to 0 to 2017. So the numbers you see in front of you for cost savings, if you look at the lower right-hand corner of this slide, that's really the important one. So this cost savings only deals with about 85 individuals. And as you heard earlier, we're serving about 700 now. So of those 85 individuals, our behavioral health division showed over a $700,000 savings with just psych crisis, crisis mobile, detox, and inpatient hospitalizations. So it's a massive savings for just 85 individuals. And again, that does not take into account any private hospitals, any police time, any criminal justice issues. That's just for those services alone. Another example, the other exciting thing that we're doing in Milwaukee right now is we're entering into agreements with HMOs and our private hospitals. We actually have a contract right now with United Healthcare, where United Healthcare is paying 100% of rent for their members to be in our Housing First program. And you would ask, why would an HMO ever do such a thing? And it's mostly because it leads to a huge cost savings for HMOs. They have individuals that cycle through emergency systems all the time, and our data has proven that with the fidelity of the Housing First model, we can drastically reduce those costs. This was our biggest example that got those contracts moving. We had an individual, and I thought this was a typo when it was given to me by our data analyst. We had an individual that had over 200 emergency room contacts in 1 year in 2017, often multiple times at the same day. That HMO gave that individual to us to be in our Housing First program. The only difference in his care was the provision of permanent supportive housing and our housing navigation services. Everything else remained the same. Those emergency room contacts went from 200 down to 13. So when HMOs and other folks around our community see that data and calculate that cost savings, it is well beyond a dollar for dollar savings for our private folks that are willing to invest in Housing First. So major themes of approach of how we built our plan to end chronic homelessness using Housing First. So how can we succeed and how we've been succeeding? These are the list of things that we focused on. So housing subsidy, again, in order to end homelessness, it always has to be focused on permanent supportive housing. Without rental subsidies, without the permanent nature of these subsidies, communities are not going to make the progress that they need to. Case management services, we increased our case management. We even added what we call Housing First case management. What we found is a lot of individuals on the street were going to refuse traditional case management models, refuse services through our behavioral health division. So we started our own Housing First case management in our housing division, which really simply meant the client determined what their care plan was, and it made no difference to us what that was. If it was bus tickets or helping them find a job or helping them get to the grocery store, if those are the only things they want case management for, that's what we provided. And that has led to very, very high rates of housing retention that we're really proud of. And a lot of what we do is completely client-centered and client-focused. Additional supportive housing developments, a majority of our housing for our Housing First program is scattered site, where an individual can get a voucher and go anywhere in Milwaukee County that they choose. We have done some project basing for individuals that really need that 24-hour on-site support. So we have done some new construction using low-income housing tax credits. Most of our housing is scattered site. Outreach and staffing, I'll go through kind of our small crew that got this off the ground and why we chose to staff it the way we did. Coordination of resources. Again, in Milwaukee, really all of our partners have embraced Housing First. So not just housing providers and mental health, but the district attorney's office, the court system, the police department, mayor, county executive. Everybody's really speaking the same language now, which has been exciting. So outreach and staffing. So it's a little rare that Milwaukee County does its own homeless outreach. So we have our own homeless outreach vans. We partner with the police department and all of our partner agencies to do homeless outreach. That has been very, very successful. Homeless outreach has been fairly fragmented in Milwaukee in the past. Now everything is completely coordinated with all of our groups, and that's made a big difference to make sure that we're covering every area. We've had weekly meetings with the police department, the district attorney's office, and the downtown business district. So the downtown business district even hosts these meetings to go over the state of downtown, if there's particular individuals that have been showing up there, if there's new small homeless encampments. It really helps all of us coordinate those activities. Our district attorney's office also is a huge supporter of Housing First. They've even gone out with us on homeless outreach to try to waive warrants and do those different types of things right on the spot on the street. So that's been a huge help. So when we started, our team was very small, but we have a homeless outreach services manager that runs our Housing First initiative. Eric Collins-Dyke is his name, and he does just an amazing job with this program. 3 housing navigators, and this is really the cornerstone of our service model. So besides permanent supportive housing and rental subsidy, these navigators follow an individual all the way from meeting somebody under a bridge all the way till and after they're in housing. So the other reason our retention rates are higher is our clients get used to seeing the same person, and regardless of where they are in the system, even if they accept traditional case management, our housing navigators remain as a part of their care plan. Our team negotiates leases with landlords. We've probably had less than 10 evictions or so out of 1,000 homeless people served over the past 2 years or so. That is because of these housing navigators. Individuals fail in their apartments. That often happens. That's okay with us. There's no discharge plan in our Housing First program. We work with landlords for what we call a mutual lease termination. We assist that individual with moving to a different apartment, and it really has helped with our landlord engagement. We also have our program evaluators, so any data side you see in this presentation, it was really important when we were trying to raise funds publicly and privately that we could show the efficacy of our program. So our program evaluator is a jack of all trades. He does some homeless outreach and some case management, but his main job is to do pre and post housing comparisons to show that our model is saving considerable amount of money for our funders. So our Homeless Outreach Collaborative, this is something that we started probably about a year or so ago. So we meet with all the folks that you see on your screen in our office on a monthly basis to completely coordinate all homeless outreach activity. It has really helped with our data collection for point in time. We're very confident that we're not missing any homeless encampments or any folks sleeping on the street because all these folks you see completely work together to plan our outreach. So we go over where folks have been spotted in the past 2 weeks, who is assigned to them, what the plan is for everybody to make sure we're not doubling and tripling up on areas and make sure that we cover the whole part of Milwaukee County. As you see on there, the police department absolutely plays a major role in Milwaukee County for how we do homeless outreach, and Lieutenant Leal has just been a fantastic leader for that. She'll tell you a little bit more about how the police department does that work. So some of our criminal justice partners, I'm sure there's a lot of you on this webinar that are involved in the Safety Justice Challenge through MacArthur. So one of the things that we did, we started here in Milwaukee a post-booking stabilization program, and to show you the full adoption of Housing First, the goal is to reduce the jail population, to take those who have mental health issues and take them out of the jail. And you have a housing division doing Housing First that's running post-booking stabilization. So that's how much buy-in we've had locally for this model. So our post-booking stabilization workers in the housing division work with the public defender's office and the district attorney's office to identify individuals right when they're booked into the jail that have mental health challenges. We assess them for our program, and as quickly as possible, our staff go to the jail, take these individuals out of the jail, find them housing, and make sure they're connected with wraparound services. So we served a little over 100 individuals in post-booking stabilization, and it's really been a fantastic model to see all the different ways that we can fully adopt the Housing First model. The other change from years ago, any homeless individuals in prior years that were sleeping in parks or county buses would often get arrested, getting tickets. And of course, when you ticket homeless individuals, if you're a law enforcement officer, our clients have no money to pay those tickets. They get arrested, they get put in jail, and the cycle continues and continues and continues. So now we're at the point, and the Milwaukee Police Department does this as well. The Milwaukee County Sheriff's Department will not evict anyone who is sleeping in our county parks anymore. They will call our outreach team before those arrests happen. So we will go out there, we will assess them for housing needs, shelter needs, and mental health needs. So that's been a big change for us. Same thing with our transit system and our bus system. A majority of these systems now call us to see if Housing First can assist them before any other interaction. We also had a county board supervisor do a formal county board resolution to make sure that our park system and our sheriff's department looks at decriminalizing homelessness and looks at this issue differently. So the other things that are fairly unique in Milwaukee is we started a homeless court pilot. I think there are other communities with homeless courts, so we're just working kind of with one municipal judge here in Milwaukee County. This has been a huge change and a huge service for our clients who are living on the street. So what this municipal judge has allowed us to do, if we encounter a homeless individual sleeping on the street, and they have an active warrant, we're able through email to get those warrants lifted by this municipal judge, as long as the client simply agrees to work with our Housing First program and work on a housing plan. Our staff reconnects with that judge within the 6 months to give an update on our client's progress. But again, if you follow the fidelity of Housing First, your housing retention rates will be so high that these individuals almost 100% of the time permanently get these warrants taken care of. The other thing that the city of Milwaukee does is Warrant Withdrawal Wednesday. So it's one day a year. It's actually coming up on August 22nd, where any citizen can show up in an attempt to get their warrants waived. As a part of that, there are employment fairs and resource fairs that are there at municipal court, and we now have a Housing First booth, so our housing staff is also there to offer potential permanent housing resources as well as potential case management services.
All right.
And
go ahead.
And yeah, with that, I will turn it over.
All right. Thank you, James. I really want to express my humble appreciation for all of you all who are here expressing an interest in this model, because we really have seen huge successes here in the city of Milwaukee. And I cannot express enough the importance of having that partnership in place. What we are able to do here in the city is really something that I'm tremendously proud of. We are pretty much in each other's email on a daily basis at one point or another. So we are in constant communication regarding anything that is going on in our community in regards to this topic. So very exciting opportunity for us, and I'm hoping that you all are able to take up this model and really utilize it in your communities, because the dividends will definitely be there. And so James talked a lot about our partnership and what the role the police department plays. And as many of you could imagine, police department is often that first point of contact that the community has with homelessness. So when we're out in the community, either by our own actions of enforcement in the community or just calls for service, we are often tasked with dealing with homelessness. And so back in about 2010, understanding the magnitude of the homelessness situation here in the city, we really thought we'd take on a new approach. And so one of the things that we looked into was our homeless outreach team. And so that team started in 2010 after some problem-oriented policing conferences and kind of looking at a new approach on how to deal with this issue. We started that team with about 6 officers in our downtown area. Again, as you can imagine, just because of the concentration of resources, we do have a huge population in our downtown area. And so that was where we decided to start our program. But I'm proud to say that from that time in 2010, we have well over 100 officers who have been trained in our homeless outreach team training. And they are cross-trained in CIT, and they are throughout the entire city. And so we are able to go out under the bridge, in under underpasses, and in some of our less populated areas, and really do outreach and kind of identify areas that our homeless housing division outreach can reach out to. So through those collaborations, we really have been able to assist other agencies, like James talked about. We work with DOT, we work with the county sheriff's department, we work with our Department of Public Works in cleaning up. So there's just a variety of things that we are able to do and be the conduit for that service. We also participate twice a year in our point in time training, because again, our interactions, we're out there in the field, we're out there in the community, so we tend to see where our encampments may pop up, where individuals in need may be, so we're able to direct our outreach team to those individuals they may not know about. But I have to say, a nod to our outreach community, that usually when we're reaching out to them and telling them, they're already engaged. And so it really is a good partnership in that sense, that the awareness and commitment to addressing this issue is throughout the whole community. And so one of the things that we really focus on, they talked about decriminalizing homelessness, and that's a huge issue for us, not just for financial reasons, which absolutely has a huge impact, but really about the compassionate approach to dealing with homelessness, understanding that there is definitely an overlap sometimes in regards to homelessness, mental health, and addiction. So how do we do that in a cost-effective way? So we definitely have incorporated that into our policy. So our policy, within our own SOP, we talk about the importance of individuals' right to occupy public space. And that's a difficult concept for a lot of individuals to understand, that putting the optics of homelessness aside, having individuals in public spaces, that's what we have public spaces for. And so understanding that every individual within the city has a right to those public spaces, and giving them access to that without going in and doing evictions and things of that nature. And so what we do is reach out to those outreach partners and see if we can get those individuals tapped into services so that they can find the permanent housing, so that they are not building up those encampments within our public spaces, because we are very proud in Milwaukee of our green space. And we want to keep that space available to everyone, but also understanding that there is this community that does not have anywhere to go, and where we are moved away from the concept of shooing them out and figuring out where they go later. We're really committed to saying, this is a public space, and in the meantime, we will look and work with our partners to try to find you somewhere to go, instead of just moving a problem from one location to another. So let's see here. Next slide. We do attend those monthly meetings, and James talked about those. We are able to share a wealth of information, and part of that is our partnership with the criminal justice system, outside of just the enforcement, but the court systems. And so our community liaison officers are a big part. They're kind of that conduit between, by the name implied, the conduit between the community and law enforcement. So our COO officer, they are geographically based in what we call districts. So our police department in our city is broken down geographically by districts, And each district has their community liaison officer team that operates out of that location. And those teams really build relationships, not just with the individuals who live and occupy those spaces, but the businesses that are operating in those spaces. So we have great relationships also with our local government so that we're all on the same page and we can kind of bring everybody to the table and have a productive, results-oriented communication. So they really leverage those relationships. Another duty, oftentimes kind of dual responsibility of our community liaison officers are what we call our community prosecution unit. And that is a officer who works directly with our DA's office and our municipal courts to kind of offset, kind of serving as diversion before it became a thing. We were working on doing these programs to try to see if we have these heavy utilizers, how can we get them services so that we are not continuing to cite them repeatedly or take them into custody repeatedly. So those partnerships have worked tremendously, not only with our private community, but with our court system. And so, next slide. Another component of our police department is our crisis assessment response team, which is often referred to as our CART team. And our CART team is a dual response unit that is a partnership with our law enforcement officers and our behavioral health division. And so our behavioral health division provides master's levels clinicians who are able to go out in the field with our officers and engage within the community. And our goal is really to promote voluntary treatment and or assessment and treatment services within the community. So understanding the trauma of taking an individual out of their surrounding, especially in a situation where there's trauma or a situation where they are in crisis, we understand that that could be detrimental to their overall trajectory of health. So we're looking at how do we go into the field and deal directly with individuals in an area where they are safe. So our CART team definitely is able to do that and reach out to them on a repeated basis because they're out there on a regular basis, reach out to the community, sometimes just building a rapport, stopping in, saying hi, dropping off resources, sometimes gloves and water, things of those nature that we really build that rapport so that we can try to help them get into services, whether it be homeless services or mental health services. They are also, our CART team is also cross-trained in our CIT training, and they're also cross-trained in our homeless outreach training. So they have all of those connections and resources to be able to reach directly out to our county housing and all of our community advocates and get resources from a variety of areas. And many of our clinicians, ironically, previously worked in homeless outreach. So that has been one of the really good blessings. And again, talking about that partnership, I'm on speed dial with our coordinator over at our behavioral health as well, so that we really can work directly with an issue in the moment, real time. We're able to sometimes call immediately and get someone into service in treatment and over to housing within the same day. So just getting them tied into those resources, not necessarily finding housing, but getting them tied into those resources that we can get that process started. So those partnerships have been tremendous for us. So looking at that individual person-centered approach is really where we focus our energy, is going in and really treating people with that humanity that they deserve. And we have been really successful in getting people into voluntary care. You see the stats here, about 600 people we've serviced last year. We're able to get into treatment or contact with our CART team, and then we were able to voluntarily get them into either community-based services or voluntary care. And then we are also able to reach directly over to housing and say, now that we've got them stabilized and outside of crisis, how do we get them into permanent housing? And Jim, the housing department, their numbers speak to themselves about how successful that has been for us. And we are actively involved in our jail diversion program, the MacArthur Grant. We work very extensively with the county to help them develop their own CART team. So within the city of Milwaukee, we have 3 CART teams that work primarily in our evenings because that's when we tend to see the most need. But we also have expanded that program through MacArthur out into the county. So our DA investigator, we have a DA investigator that is able to go out and participate in CART services, but we've even started to expand into other jurisdictions. So one of our neighboring jurisdictions has also taken up that model and did that dual response and have already started to see significant results. And lastly, because of that partnership with BHD and all the different partners, if we have a client that maybe has where our contact with them may have previously been considered under a criminal enforcement component, we look at that situation. We're able to get crisis services. We're able to reach directly over to our DA CART team and get them involved in any criminal justice components. And then obviously we're able to use our relationships within the community to kind of keep an eye out when they're out in the field. We can get until we get them stabilized. So all those different partners in place have really been useful to us in regards to services. So,
excuse me, Lieutenant Liebel.
Yes.
I'm going to interrupt just to say that we only have a couple minutes left. We're going to keep the webinar open so that you can finish, and we've got great questions coming in. We're going to answer as many as we can. We know that some people are going to have to leave. So stay as long as you can. We'll answer these questions. Whatever we can't, we will post. And also maybe write out the Q&A on the webinar page. Go ahead.
All right, no problem at all. I'll keep these short. The slides kind of speak to themselves. A significant number of our citizens within the community utilizing HousingFirst had contact with us in a prior way with some criminal justice citation, a municipal thing involved. So we've seen a significant impact in that and being able to really reduce that. And as James talked about our Warrant Wednesday, that's a huge program that has been going on for several years and is highly successful in getting those obstacles out the way for our individuals to find housing. So we really want to look away from the enforcement component of it and really looking at ourselves as that conduit to service, because we may be that first point of contact. And then lastly, this slide will just kind of show, it'll kind of show just how our trajectory for citations kind of mirrors our HousingFirst model when it comes to our homelessness and chronic homelessness. We've seen a significant reduction in our citations because we're removing that obstacle for individuals to get into housing. And as Ms. Matthew talked about before, if someone is homeless and unable to pay for housing, they definitely are not going to be able to pay for a citation. And so having those citations turn into warrant and the cost that has, not only for our cost of service to go and pick people up, but to house them, book them, process through the court system, is just really not a good return on our investment when we're talking about the use of officers. So getting our community to understand that and really engage in that was an obstacle. But now that we're all on board, it is all hands on deck in regards to that mentality, because we see the numbers speak for themselves. So I'll wrap up there so we can leave room for questions if this last little bit of time. So thank you all for listening to us. And I know we kind of went through quickly, but by all means, you're welcome to contact me with any additional questions if you need. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. This has been so informative. I think the first question would be for Kim Keaton. What is the advice for someone who is working with people to connect people with criminal backgrounds to housing, considering the limitations on HUD income-based housing?
Sure. The way I understand that question is around limitations on HUD-funded housing that for people with criminal backgrounds, and that's actually a pretty common misconception. HUD, like, you know, the federal HUD, they only have two criminal background pieces that they mandate are not allowed into any housing that's funded by HUD, whether that's through a voucher program or like physical public housing. And those two things are conviction of the manufacture of methamphetamine in public housing, and the second is presence on the lifetime sex offender list. So it's actually a small just a couple things. Housing authorities locally kind of come up with their own additional criteria, and it is possible if you do have a housing authority locally that has some strict criteria, they have flexibility in changing that criteria. It's not hard and fast. And so I recommend really talking to your housing authority. If you're finding something like, oh, no crime can be, person can't have been convicted of a crime in the past 5 years. That's a common one. Many housing authorities will actually take a flexible look at that and see, like, okay, so this person has committed a crime, but they've served their time and they haven't done anything since, and they're, engaging with these services and want to be in this housing, they may actually, overlook that or be willing to overlook that.
And a lot of these questions can be answered by CSH staff, right? If they were to go on to your website, especially on the training page, if people have questions.
Yep. I definitely recommend going to our website, going to csh.org/training. There are a lot of great resources too put out by other organizations such as the Schreiber Center for Law. I think it's called the Schreiber Center for Law and Policy. They have a great publication on how to create more access for people with criminal backgrounds.
Another question came in for you, and this is true for a lot of cities, especially with not much affordable housing. How can you build or identify housing inventory in an area where there is limited affordable housing?
That's a really great question. It's a multi-pronged strategy and not easily answerable in a short answer. But one thing I'll say is that partnerships with landlords are key, and so where you have a lack of affordable housing, so you have a small rental vacancy rate, your partnerships with landlords are key, and so those partnerships can really help to increase unit by unit the amount of housing stock available for our populations. Some strategies to use with landlords are things like master leasing. So that's where, for example, a nonprofit that's running the supportive housing initiative would hold the lease for the landlord and then sublease to the tenant, and therefore would be liable for any damage to the unit. That's one thing. And the other thing is to really through your local municipality development pipeline, like whether it's developing affordable housing stock, whether you have a housing trust fund, and all those sorts of things, it's really come together and start to develop an affordable and supportive housing pipeline. The more that you can be sort of constantly working on building more units of capacity, the more capacity that you'll have that aren't subject to market rates.
Thank you. Okay, so for Milwaukee, how did you go about finding your housing? Did you build your own, or were individuals housed throughout the city in private apartments?
Sure. So a vast majority of our units for our chronic homelessness plan is scattered site that is existing housing. So each housing market is different. Again, if you live in a city where affordable housing is a challenge, you might have to be doing new construction with low-income housing tax credits. But for markets across the country where you at least could theoretically access existing housing if you had enough vouchers, that's without question the quickest way to do it. So we had many existing relationships with landlords. So when we increased our voucher supply, we were able to work with our landlords fairly easily. But the biggest selling point for us, for landlords, was that most of our landlords don't even necessarily have to deal with their tenants. They can deal with our housing navigator staff. So that was really a big thing for us. And I think our clients really appreciate being able to get a scattered site voucher and choose their own unit. So if they want to stay in the city, they can. If they want to go to a suburb, they can. And we help with that housing search. But it really helps with housing retention to try to do a scattered site approach like that. We have done plenty of low-income housing tax credit buildings in Milwaukee, one specifically for chronically homeless individuals. Once you start down this path, there are going to be individuals that you have to treat differently, and we're lucky because the county's housing authority is also under our control, so we can change some of those local rules and preferences that Kim talked about. Our latest apartments, and actually just won a HUD Healthy Homes Award, was our Thurgood Marshall Apartments. It's a 24-unit apartment building for chronically homeless, but also those with chronic alcohol issues. So they're individuals that have failed in treatment, went to detox dozens and dozens of times, and they were still sleeping on the street because of that. So we did do a project-based development for those individuals. We deal with all those substance abuse issues in their housing units. So they are allowed to drink. We deal with all those challenges and behavioral challenges right in their unit, but without creating some of those specialized housing units, you're really not going to get to functional zero for chronic homelessness.
Thank you. Here's a big one for law enforcement. We're always wondering about buy-in. How long did it take to build a relationship between the police department and BID in Milwaukee, and what was the first major step in that partnership?
Wow. I think for one, it was getting buy-in within our department. So we had to start there and getting our department to understand the cost savings is the easy. You know, when you can show numbers of how it cuts down on our cost for service, it cuts down on our manpower demands, that really got a lot of buy-in from our department. And so then it was really about reaching out to our community partners in our bids and letting them know, let's educate about what homelessness is. And so a lot of it was just misinformation on the part of the community. So once we were able to share information and educate, not just about kind of some of the causes of homelessness and the cost of repeated calls and enforcement when we treat it as a criminal issue, but educating them about what they can do. Because what we found was a lot of our community partners just wanted to do something. And so once we pointed them in a direction of, here is a better option, they pretty much jumped on board. You know, there's always going to be some stigma associated with homelessness and, like I said, the optics of that. But once people really understood some of the causes and what they could do as an alternative to address it, we really had a lot of buy-in pretty early on. So I think giving people that option and giving them an awareness of where it's going to go. We didn't really get into, but one of the programs we have with our bid is our we have a key to change, where people are able to give funds to a particular program that helps out organizations that deal directly with homelessness in a way to combat panhandling. So instead of the stigma associated with panhandling, even though that's a completely separate issue from homelessness, when we were saying you are able to give funds to it directly to services, so you know that the money you're giving is being utilized to help individuals suffering with homelessness or mental health, then that was something that people were really on board with.
Thank you. That is so helpful, and it's helpful for a bunch of different programs. I know that it's past 2 o'clock. We're just going to keep going for a couple more questions. And then for those of you who don't have your questions answered, we'll try to get those answered and send the answers to you. Is there a role for state government in your program, or is it a city-county effort alone?
Oh, I'll let you handle that one, James.
Okay, so there absolutely is a role for state government. Here for HousingFirst, Milwaukee County has been, besides HUD, has been really the major or sole funder of HousingFirst in Milwaukee County. The state of Wisconsin, for the first time, started to put some funds into homelessness just this past budget cycle. You're only going to get so far dealing with traditional HUD funding and your local housing authority and local city government. You're going to get to the point where you're going to run out of resources really quickly. So there absolutely is a role at the state level. One of the ways we've been able to tap that is low-income housing tax credits in Wisconsin are handled through the state agency. We have done upwards of 15 permanent supportive housing developments using low-income housing tax credits that we work with our state agency for. So that's one of the best ways we've done that. There are certain states across the country that absolutely have this right. If there's anybody on the call from Minnesota, what the state of Minnesota does with their group residential housing program, if folks across the nation would replicate what they do in Minnesota, you would see an enormous reduction in homelessness. So they've really taken a lead with investing in permanent housing, paying for rental subsidies. It's something we bring up here in Wisconsin as something that we hope folks can strive for.
Thanks, that's very helpful. We're going to ask a question, and I'm going to ask it exactly the way that it was asked, that it was written in, and this is just for clarity's sake. I think actually that Lieutenant Liebel answered this in her presentation, but just for clarity, for Milwaukee, who runs the Housing Division Police Department within the agency?
All right. Well, our homeless outreach team was something that I was overseeing as a coordinator, and so it was kind of one of these situations where I, as an employee of the police department, a lieutenant, was centrally located within our academy for training purposes, but all of the officers who were trained in homeless outreach training are dispatched throughout the city. So they report to their respective commanders, but they were trained by me. And so again, if I was contacted by one of our community partners regarding an encampment or an individual in need, I would be able to reach out to those individuals. So I don't necessarily deploy them, but I'm kind of the conduit for the information. So, and vice versa, if a community has information and they want to get that information to housing, I can always work in the other direction and get that information over to our housing department. So every individual officer reports to their district commander, but I was the coordinator, kind of the conduit to information between the two, if that helps out. We don't have,
that helps us.
Yeah, we don't have a homeless outreach team unit because the issue is throughout the entire city.
And how are the CART clinicians provided? Are they employees of a local behavioral health provider that's provided through grant funding or a formal MOU, or are they employed by the police department? How does that work?
Yes, our clinicians for the CART team are employees of the behavioral health division. And so that program started as a pilot from our behavioral health division. They actually reached out and initially they funded our police officers under a grant. So they had an MOU with us that said, we will pay you if you provide us with officers to go out in the field and do this outreach. And once we saw the significant impact of that initiative, then we jumped on board and we found the money within our own budget to not only have that team, but expand it. And so that's where we're up to the 3. But we, even for our 3rd team, initially that was funded under a private entity to help fund some of those, offset that cost. So it definitely, again, is about not treating this in a silo, but working together through our private donors, through our behavioral health, through our legislature, and getting everyone on board to make it a possibility. But they are employees of our behavioral health division, and the officers are employed with us, but we operate under an MOU.
Thank you. Has the opioid epidemic created a need to change any of your strategies or program models?
I wouldn't say so for us. For law enforcement, there are other initiatives that are dealing directly with opioid. So some of those initiatives may also be tied into the outreach that we're doing within the community. But for us, our enforcement efforts in regards to dealing with homelessness, we still have that homeless first approach where we deal with the addiction after the housing. So I'm not sure if
Thank
James
you.
has anything differently on their end, but that's kind of how we approach it.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Regarding the warrants, are the warrants lifted just for misdemeanors or for felonies too?
Warrant Wednesday, that works for municipal warrants. And so, but we look at, most of our issues are the municipal warrants because we're writing people citations for nuisance offenses. So that's where we see the bulk of the obstacle. So that's where we're really looking at when we do that warrant withdrawal. So if there's violent crime, obviously we're not lifting warrants on that, but we have other options within our court system under MacArthur Grant where we're really looking at would someone be better served in a mental health capacity or in the criminal justice capacity. So there's other diversion programs to address some of those. So we're not even getting to the state of a warrant if we can get them into the right services from the beginning.
Thank you. And James, and you may have answered this already, and we're getting it in a couple of different ways. And so if you've already answered it, I apologize. But how is the county paying for all of this?
That is an excellent question. So our biggest source of revenue that has changed is we get $1 million from our behavioral health division. Our behavioral health division is overseen by a mental health board. So that was the significant funding to kick us off. It pays for our staff as well as a lot of our case management contracts and some of our supportive housing contracts. So again, the theory was in the behavioral health division, based on our early data, that with that investment, they would still see that cost savings. We've been able to show that. So that's been a major source of our funding, is our local Milwaukee County Behavioral Health Division. The other thing that helped, for those of you that want to have discussions with your housing authority, without cooperation from local housing authorities, you're not going to get very far with Housing First. So one of our big resources for permanent supportive housing is we changed our Milwaukee County Housing Authority and opened up a homeless preference to our waiting list. So we prioritize homeless individuals with every single one of our vouchers in the housing authority. So it really opened up a new housing subsidy source for us on the subsidy side. But as far as how to pay for services, a lot of that has been the behavioral health division. We're now, as we are ending chronic homelessness and moving into category 1 homelessness, we're really doing a more of a push for private dollars. Lieutenant Liebel talked about the Key to Change program. We also just started a Housing First endowment with a local foundation. We recently put kiosks at the airport to collect funds for that. So we're really trying to kick off more of a private financing campaign for the next part of our plan to end homelessness, because you can't just do this with public dollars alone.
And Kim, to follow up on that question, what funding is there in general to start a Housing First program?
Well, probably the greatest and most traditional source of rental supports is through HUD Continuum of Care funding. The services are paid for either through HUD or through other types of grants, including from there's SAMHSA CABI grants and other federal, even Second Chance Act, MIOCRA, Justice Reinvestment Act grants can pay for services as well. Increasingly, we're seeing communities, as Jim is talking about in Milwaukee, investing in their own supply of supportive housing, which is a really cool thing to do because you can control the types of people that go into that supportive housing. It doesn't have to all be chronically homeless, for example. And so those types of funding are, they could come through Medicaid waivers, so that would really be on the services side. They could be tax set aside. So in Los Angeles, there was a measure that was voted on in that county where voters decided that they wanted a tiny increase in tax in order to pay for housing for homeless individuals. There are, there could be state funds. There's, it really runs the gamut. I would say that in particular on the justice system side, health systems are really starting to get into paying for housing because they see it really in their bottom line, as Jim was saying. On the justice side, it's been a little bit slower. However, there's a real increase in communities trying to find funding to start supportive housing initiatives like FUSE, which is for frequent users, high utilizers, and include those in their justice reform efforts from, for example, criminal justice coordinating council or something like that. I've seen mental health jail diversion funds being used to pay for the housing, the rent, and the services in housing, under the, sort of idea that, we have homeless individuals with mental health issues and they're just better served in housing, and that has been enough in some cases. Those are some of the sources. There's really a lot, and I think that we're in a time of great innovation in the supportive housing field where communities are really starting to come up with a lot of new and interesting ideas, including one I forgot to mention, investment from the private sector in housing, and that's sort of in the social impact bond space.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have one more question. This is a point of clarification. I want to thank everybody who stayed on the webinar, who has been on the webinar, and all of our speakers. And my question was just, okay, does Milwaukee have a coordinated entry system?
It does. And one of the changes it's probably been about 2 years ago, all of our housing resources now go through coordinated entry. So at first it was shelters and transitional, but we're at the point now where all of our permanent housing also goes through coordinated entry. So when folks are working on chronic homelessness and you start making progress, you're really able through coordinated entry to have what is called a housing prioritization list. So we could literally pull up a list that's pretty firmly vetted at this point of the next 100 people, how long they've been homeless, where they are, who they're assigned to, and that's all done through coordinated entry. So that's really the best way to do that. When you start sidestepping coordinated entry, sometimes you have shelters and other providers kind of housing their own clients and not really looking at who's been on the street the longest, who's the most vulnerable. So we found really in order to have sustainable success as a community, you have to have a strong coordinated entry system, and you really need all your resources flowing through that centralized access point.
Thank you very much. That is all of our questions. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank our speakers so much for all the information they gave us today. We're going to end the webinar. Like I said, it's recorded. It will be posted. I hope everybody has a great rest of their day. Thank you very much.